My daughter-in-law booked a private villa in Tuscany for the whole family. When I showed up at the door, she said, "This trip is for real family only. Walter." My son stood behind her and said nothing. I smiled, told them to enjoy Italy, and drove back to my empty house. 3 days later, when they arrived at the villa, the property manager was waiting at the gate. He said, "Mr. Calloway, the owner is already here. He'd like to welcome you personally." The look on my daughter-in-law's face when she saw me standing in the courtyard holding a glass of Chianti, that's a moment I'll carry for the rest of my life. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Walter Calloway. I'm 63 years old. And for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people look through, rather than at. Not because I'm invisible, because I let them. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation from October through March. My house in Knoxville, Tennessee sits on a corner lot that needs new gutters, and probably always will. From the outside, I look like exactly what my daughter-in-law thinks. I am a retired maintenance supervisor living on a fixed income. Useful when the toilet backs up. Embarrassing at dinner parties. That's what she sees. That's what I let her see. The truth is something else entirely. My son, Daniel, married Brooke 6 years ago in a ceremony that cost me $28. Ling, ling, ling. I wrote the check without hesitation. The way I'd written every check for Daniel since his mother, Carol, passed from ovarian cancer when he was 24. The way I'd paid his college loans when the teaching job didn't come through. The way I'd covered the down payment on the house in Brentwood they couldn't quite afford. The way I'd wired $12,000 to their joint account 18 months ago when Brooke's car lease ballooned and Daniel called me in a panic. Voice low, like he didn't want her to hear him asking. I kept a ledger, not to hold it over him. Just because I'm precise by nature, $71,400 over 9 years. Give or take. Brooke knew about some of it. Not all of it. She knew about the wedding. She knew about the house down payment because Daniel told her, though the way she thanked me a single text that said, "Daniel told me you helped with the house." That was nice, suggested she'd already revised the story in her head to something smaller. Less significant. More forgettable. She came from money. Her father, Gerald, ran a successful commercial real estate firm in Nashville. They had a lake house in Hendersonville and took annual trips to Europe. The kind where you stay in places with thread count conversations. Brooke had grown up understanding that certain people had resources and certain people didn't, and that this difference was permanent and morally relevant. I fell clearly into the second category. The category of people you tolerate at holidays but don't seat near the interesting guests. She wasn't cruel about it. That would have been easier to name. She was dismissive in the way that well-mannered people are when they've decided someone doesn't count light. Efficient. Impersonal. She called me Walter even after I'd asked her twice. Gently. To call me Dad, or at least Mr. Calloway. She redirected conversations I entered. She answered questions. I asked Daniel by speaking to Daniel. Not to me. She photographed every gathering, except the ones that included me. Or cropped me to the edge before posting. Daniel saw it. I know he did. Because occasionally I'd catch him watching it happen, with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who has decided that keeping the peace is the same as doing the right thing. It isn't. But that's a lesson my son was still learning. The Tuscany announcement came on a Sunday in March. Daniel called. Rather than texted, which I noted, he used the voice he uses when delivering news he's already decided is non-negotiable. Dad, we're doing a family trip this summer. Tuscany. 2 weeks. Mid-July. Brooke's parents are coming. her brother, and his wife. And us. That sounds wonderful. I said, Tuscany in July. The light must be incredible. A pause. Careful. The thing is, the villa rental is already set. It's a specific number of bedrooms, and it's already divided up between everyone. We don't have the space. I waited. I just didn't want you to hear about it from someone else. That was considerate of him. At least. He was telling me, rather than letting me find out through a photograph posted from a vineyard. I appreciated that enough to let the silence sit for a moment, without filling it. Of course. I said, I hope everyone has a wonderful time. Dad. I'm sorry. It's just the logistics, Daniel. It's fine. Truly. It wasn't fine. But I'd learned a long time ago that grief and anger are more useful when they're quiet. I hung up and sat in Carol's chair, the wingback by the window, that I've never reupholstered because it still smells faintly like her. Or I imagine it does, and I thought for a long time about what kind of man I was going to be about this. Carol would have said, Walter, don't let it eat you. Let it teach you. She was smarter than both of us. I opened my laptop. Not the old Dell I keep in the kitchen for recipes and weather. The other one, the one in my office closet. Password protected. Running through a VPN I set up in 2018, when I started taking my privacy more seriously. The one that showed a portfolio my family had no idea existed. After Carol died, I changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways people noticed. I still drove the Ford. Still wore the flannels. Still fixed the gutters myself, and brought covered dishes to neighborhood funerals, and watched football with Daniel when he had time. But something in me had reorganized. Carol had been the warmth in our house. And without her, I built something else. Something cold and patient and entirely mine. I'd been a maintenance supervisor for Henley Industrial for 22 years. Not glamorous, but I'd watched machines. I'd watched systems. I'd learned to see what was worn and what was solid, what would hold and what would fail. And somewhere around 2009, when the economy was shredding itself and property values had collapsed, I started applying that same eye to real estate. A duplex in East Knoxville, bought for $64,000 at a bank auction. A commercial building on Chapman Highway, purchased from a family whose business had folded. A vacation rental property in Gatlinburg, the Smokies, were always going to draw people, regardless of economy. A 4-unit apartment building in Maryville. Then, in 2016, something larger. A small inn in the hill country outside Fredericksburg, Texas. 12 rooms. A vine garden. A restored farmhouse. The previous owners were divorcing and had priced it to sell quickly. I bought it for $640. Ling ling ling. Brought in a full-time manager named Elaine and spent 6 months on weekends repairing what needed repairing. By 2019, it was generating $180. 000 a year, and had been featured in a Texas travel magazine under a headline about hidden gems. Everything operated under Callaway Holdings LLC. Registered in my middle name. James Callaway. On paper, Walter Callaway. To everyone who knew me. Total portfolio value, as of last January, $2. 8 millions. Daniel knew I owned some rental properties. He'd never asked for details. Brooke, I was certain, had never asked at all. I sat in front of that laptop the Sunday night Daniel called about Tuscany, and I did something I hadn't planned. I opened a browser tab and searched private villa rentals, Tuscany, Italy, summer availability. I wasn't sure yet what I was looking for. But I was looking. Brooke called 3 days later. This surprised me. She almost never called. Texts were her preferred medium short, occasionally warm, carefully bounded. Walter. I just wanted to say, I know Daniel talked to you about July. I hope there are no hard feelings. The villa only sleeps 10, and with Gerald and Patrice, and Scott and Megan Brooke. I said, no hard feelings whatsoever. You and Daniel deserve a wonderful vacation. I'm glad you understand. Her tone shifted almost imperceptibly lighter. Relieved. The relief of someone who expected resistance and found none. You know it's nothing personal. Of course not. I said. After I hung up, I wrote the phrase nothing personal in my notebook and underlined it twice. Then I found the listing I'd been looking at for 3 days. Villa Cipressa, a historic property outside Montalcino. In the Tuscan hills, an 8-bedroom stone farmhouse with a private vineyard, a pool carved into the hillside, a wine cellar stocked with the estate's own Brunello, and a property manager named Marco who had overseen the estate for 11 years. It had been listed for sale by a retiring Swiss couple who had owned it since 1999 and maintained it with the precision of people who understood that beautiful things require constant tending. Asking price too, €1 million. It was priced to move. I called my accountant, Pat Simmons. The next morning, I need to run some numbers on a foreign property acquisition. Italy. Can you be in my office Friday? Your office in the house. My office in the house. Yes. Pat had known about Callaway Holdings for years. He was careful, discreet, and had never once asked me why I kept it quiet from my family. He was good at reading which questions not to ask. We spent 4 hours Friday going through the portfolio, the liquid assets, the international acquisition process, the tax implications. Villa Cipressa wasn't a stretch. It was, on paper, a smart investment. A property with existing wine production, proven rental income during the high season, and a motivated seller. Is there a timeline consideration? Pat asked, not looking up from his spreadsheet. Yes. I need to close by July 1st. He looked up. My son's family is renting a property near there for 2 weeks, starting July 14th. Pat is a small man with very still eyes. He looked at me for a long moment, then returned to his spreadsheet. I'll contact an Italian attorney by Monday. I flew to Rome on April 28th. Marco met me at the Siena train station in a white Land Rover and drove me up into the hills in the long afternoon, light hills the color of old gold. Cypress trees, standing like quiet sentinels along the ridgeline. When we turned onto the property road, and I saw the farmhouse for the first time, stone gray and solid and enormous against the vine-striped hillside, I understood why the Swiss couple had kept it for 25 years. Some places hold something in the air. Villa Cipressa held it. The inspection took 2 days. The bones were extraordinary walls, 400 years old. A wine cellar that predated the farmhouse above it. An irrigation system that Marco had upgraded at his own initiative in 2021. The pool was perfect. The kitchen was recently renovated. And 3 of the guest suites had views over the valley that I stood in front of for longer than was strictly professional. We agreed on one, 95 millions euros. The owner, a trim man named Heinrich, who shook hands precisely and spoke to me in immaculate English, seemed genuinely relieved. He was 74 and had been managing the sale from Zurich for 8 months. When I told him I intended to keep the property as a working estate and luxury rental, he nodded with satisfaction. Marco will stay, he asked. Marco stays, I said, and gets a raise. Marco, standing nearby, looked at his shoes with the expression of a man trying not to show too much emotion. The paperwork took 3 weeks. Italian property law is thorough and unhurried. Like Italy itself. My attorney, a sharp Roman woman named Claudia Ferretti, navigated every requirement with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to be surprised by anything. Callaway Holdings International LLC closed on Villa Cipressa on June 18th. I flew home on June 20th and said nothing to anyone. Daniel called on June 23rd. Excited. The tension of our earlier conversation dissolved. We're all packed and ready. 2 weeks. Dad, I wish you could come. He sounded like he meant it, which made it harder and easier simultaneously. Send me photographs. I said, I want to see the countryside. We will. Love you. Dad, love you too. The family flew out July 14th. I drove to the airport. Not to see them off. They didn't know I was there, but because I needed to do something with my hands. And driving always helped me think. I watched the departure boards from a coffee shop near the terminal entrance. Their flight to Rome departed at 6:45 p.m. I watched the board flip to departed and felt something in my chest that was neither regret nor satisfaction. Something quieter than both. I flew out July 15th. Marco picked me up from Siena again. Same white Land Rover. Same late afternoon light. We drove up into the hills and I watched the property approach the way I'd watched it the first time, with the specific pleasure of something that is now yours. The other guests arrive tomorrow. Marco said, the American family. They have already called 3 times about the pool temperature. The Ashford party. I said, a small rental I'd arranged through a local agency for the first week. Separate from the wing I'd kept reserved. Yes. And the other family. Your son's group, they arrive, July 14th. Tonight, I checked my watch. They'd land in Rome around noon local time. Drive to Siena, then to Montalcino. 4 hours minimum. I had time. I changed into clean clothes, pressed trousers, a simple linen shirt. Nothing extravagant, and walked through my property in the early evening light. I walked the vineyard rows, checked in with Elena, the housekeeper, about the suite arrangements, reviewed the wine cellar inventory that Marco had prepared, ate a simple dinner of pasta and estate wine alone on the terrace overlooking the valley. The sun set over Tuscany the way it does, slowly, lavishly, like it has nowhere else to be. At 8:47 p.m., I heard gravel on the approach road. I stayed on the terrace. I heard car doors, voices, Brooke's laugh, sharp and bright, Gerald's baritone, Daniel's voice saying something I couldn't make out, the sound of luggage being handled, Marco's measured greeting, more voices, movement, the farmhouse doors opening. I waited exactly 7 minutes. Then I stood, set down my wine glass, and walked through the farmhouse to the main entrance. They were in the foyer, surrounded by luggage, taking in the vaulted stone ceiling, the exposed beams, the ancient terracotta floor. Brooke had her phone raised for a photograph. Gerald was turning slowly in place, with the expression of a man doing involuntary calculations. Patrice, his wife, had already touched the stone wall with her palm, the way people touch beautiful old things. Daniel was the first to see me. I watched his face move through 4 things in about 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, a flash of something like fear, and then a kind of helpless wonder that I hadn't seen on him since he was a boy who had done something he didn't know whether to be ashamed or proud of. Dad, Brooke's phone lowered. She turned. The expression on her face was worth every closed door, every cropped photograph, every conversation she'd redirected away from me. It was the expression of a person whose entire map of a situation has just proven wrong, and who has not yet assembled a new one. Walter. Her voice came out smaller than usual, uncertain. Good evening, I said. How was the drive from Rome? Gerald and Patrice had turned. Scott, Daniel's brother-in-law, had appeared in the doorway behind them, carrying a wine bag, and he stopped mid-step with a wine bottle suspended in the air between his hands. What Brooke started, then stopped. She looked at the stone walls, the vaulted ceiling. Back at me. What are you doing here? I live here, I said. As of June 18th. Silence. Daniel said, very quietly. You bought this. I did. This whole he gestured at the walls. The ceiling. The property beyond. This property. The farmhouse. The vineyard. The wine cellar. All of it. Gerald, to his credit, absorbed this faster than the others. He had spent 40 years in commercial real estate. He understood immediately what had happened. Even if not the why or the how, his expression shifted to something cautious and, I thought, marginally respectful. Brooke found her voice first, which didn't surprise me. This is our vacation rental. We booked it. We have a contract. You booked it through Cielo Rentals Agency. I said, which contracts on behalf of the property owner, which is me, through Callaway Holdings International LLC. That can't be. She looked at Marco, who stood near the door, with the stillness of a man who has decided to be very much invisible. When did you? April. I said, I signed in June. Gerald let out a single, short sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. I want you to know, I said, addressing all of them, that your reservation stands. Every room, as booked, the full 2 weeks, the pool, the vineyard tours, the wine cellar access. In the breakfast service, everything you were promised. Nothing changes. Brooke stared at me. Daniel had gone very still. I'm not here to disrupt your vacation. I continued. I'm here because I own this property, and I have business to attend to. I've kept the east wing for my own use. You'll have the main house and the guest wing entirely to yourselves. Marco and Elena will ensure everything is exactly as expected. You could have told us, Daniel said. His voice was careful, trying to find the right register for something that didn't have one. I agreed. When would have been the right moment? When you called to tell me there wasn't room for me? When Brooke called to make sure there were no hard feelings? Brooke's jaw tightened. I'm not angry, I said, which was mostly true. I'm here. That's all. Gerald stepped forward then, extending his hand. Walter. Gerald Marsh. I think we've only met twice. 3 times. I said, shaking it. The wedding, Daniel's promotion dinner, and the Christmas before last. Something moved in Gerald's face. I suppose that's right. He held my eyes a moment longer than a standard handshake warranted. This is a remarkable property. It is, I said. Heinrich and Ursula kept it beautifully for 25 years. I intend to continue that. Marco stepped forward smoothly. If I can show everyone to their rooms, dinner can be ready on the terrace in 1 hour. Elena has prepared something simple with the estate vegetables. The group began to move Patrice, following Marco, Scott still holding the wine. Gerald lingering a moment longer near me with that evaluating expression. Daniel was last. He stopped beside me. I looked at my son. He looked at me. Dad, he said, and then stopped. Go get settled. I said, we'll talk. Dinner was civil in the way that meals are, when everyone is managing something large and unspoken. The terrace held us all. The long farm table set with estate, wine, and Elena's pasta and bread still warm from the oven. The valley spread below us in the purple Tuscan dusk. Villages lit like scattered embers on the darkening hills. Brooke sat across from me and barely spoke. This was unusual. Normally, she managed every table with the practiced fluency of a woman raised for social competence. Tonight, she ate carefully and spoke to Patrice about flight delays and said nothing to me at all, which told me everything about what she was feeling. Gerald asked me, over the second glass of Brunello, how long I'd been in real estate. 14 years. I said, started after my wife passed. Carol, Daniel said quietly, from down the table. Carol. Gerald nodded. I'm sorry. That's a hard thing. It was, I said. It taught me what to do with time. Scott, who had been watchful and quiet all evening, leaned forward slightly. How big is the portfolio? If you don't mind, Scott, Megan said. It's a fair question. I said, several properties across Tennessee and Texas. This is the first international acquisition, all through a holding company, Callaway Holdings. My middle name. Gerald looked at me over his wine glass with an expression that had completed its transition into something I recognized as genuine interest. The interest of a man who has been in a room with another man for years without actually seeing him, and has just recalibrated. Brooke was looking at the valley. After dinner, I walked the vineyard alone in the dark. The vines ran in long rows down the hillside, leaves black against the navy sky. I could hear the others on the terrace behind me, voices dropping low. The particular murmur of people processing something together without being able to say it plainly. I thought about Carol. I thought about what she would make of all this. She had been a woman of strong opinions, and she had never particularly liked Brooke. Not because of anything overt, but because she had an instinct for the shape of people's consideration who extended it genuinely and who rationed it according to utility. She rations it, Carol had said once, early in Daniel and Brooke's relationship, setting down her tea with the finality of a diagnosis. I thought about the ledger, $71,400. Not mentioned, not leveraged, not deployed, just known. I thought about Daniel's face in the foyer when he recognized me. Not angry, not hostile, but genuinely undone. He hadn't known. He hadn't known because I hadn't told him. This was not the same as him not caring. I walked back to the east wing and sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop and looked at the Callaway Holdings portfolio without really seeing it. After a while, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence. This was never about the money. The next 3 days found their own uneasy rhythm. Breakfast was served communally at 9 on the terrace. Elena's eggs and bread, and the estate, honey and fruit from the market in Montalcino. The first morning was formal and stiff. Conversation distributed carefully around neutral topics. The heat, the views, plans for the day. Brooke organized excursions with the efficiency of someone who needed to be in motion. A winery tour Tuesday, Siena on Wednesday, San Quirico d'Orsia on Thursday, and she extended each invitation to include me in the same voice she would use to invite a stranger. Politely, without warmth, without expectation, I accepted none of them. I spent my days working. I met twice with Marco about the property's operational calendar. I reviewed the rental income projections Pat had sent. I walked the vineyard with Marco's assistant, a young man named Filippo, who knew every vine individually. I drove into Montalcino alone one morning and had coffee at a bar in the main square and watched the Italians go about their morning with the specific, unhurried competence of people who have been doing this for a very long time. Gerald found me on the terrace the second evening. After the others had gone in, he sat down without asking, which I appreciated. A man comfortable enough to sit without permission is a man willing to be honest. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. I've been at family events with you for 6 years, and I've never made a point of knowing you. That was my failure, and I want to acknowledge it. I looked at him. He was a large man in his late 60s, white-haired, with the permanently tanned face of someone who spends real time outdoors. He had the manner of someone accustomed to authority, not arrogance, but the settled ease of a man whose judgments have been confirmed often enough that he trusts them. Brooke's manner toward people is something she learned from me. He said, I'm not proud of that. She learned to evaluate people by what they appear to have. Yes. He didn't flinch from it. And you appeared to have less than you do. I appeared to have less than she thought mattered. I said. He was quiet a moment. That's a more precise version. We sat with the valley below us. The lights of 3 villages visible in the dark distance. Daniel is a good man, Gerald said. He is. He's been in an uncomfortable position. He chose the position. I said, but yes, he's a good man. Gerald nodded. He poured wine from the bottle Marco had left on the table estate Brunello, deep and slow, and poured a second glass for me without asking, which was either presumption or comfort, and I decided to take it as comfort. What do you intend to do with this property? He asked. Keep it. Improve it. Run it properly. You could make considerable money renting it at high season rates. I intend to. I also intend to use it. He looked at me. Family, perhaps. If certain things change. He received that without argument. The conversation I had with Daniel happened on the 4th morning. He knocked on the east wing door at 7. Before Elena had set breakfast. He was in running clothes and carrying 2 coffees from the kitchen espresso machine, which meant he'd been planning it. I let him in, and we sat at the window, overlooking the vineyard, in the early light. He didn't know how to begin. I watched him work through 3 or 4 false starts before he abandoned the approach and just looked at me directly. I should have pushed back. He said, yes. When she said the villa didn't have room, when she, on other things, I should have said something. You should have said something a long time before the villa. I said. He accepted this without deflection. Which was the Daniel I knew before the Daniel he had become in the years with Brooke. I think I told myself that keeping the peace was protecting everyone. He said, including you, that if I didn't make it a conflict, it would stay manageable. It stayed manageable for her. I said, not for me. He looked down at his coffee. I know. I'm not asking you to choose between us. I said, that's not what this is. But I need you to understand that staying silent while someone treats your father as an afterthought is not neutral. It's a decision. You made that decision repeatedly, and I felt each one. Daniel's jaw moved. $71,000. I said, I kept a ledger, not to hold it over you, but because I knew that someday I'd need to be precise about what I had given and what I'd received in return. I looked at him. I'm not asking for the money back. I never was. I'm telling you that I gave it freely and was made to feel, in ways large and small, that I was a burden rather than a father. That distinction matters to me. He looked up. His eyes were wet, which was something I hadn't seen since Carol's funeral. I'm sorry, Dad. The words were plain and quiet. The way real things are. I looked at my son in the early Tuscan light, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a long time. Not forgiveness. Exactly, forgiveness was slower than this. It would take months. Would require something from both of us. But the beginning of a direction, a door opening rather than closing. I know you are. I said, that's enough for today. The conversation with Brooke was different. She came to me on the 6th day. Not with coffees and running clothes, but in full presentational armor, hair done. Posture precise. Her expression, carrying the composed dignity of a woman who has prepared remarks. She sat across from me in the East Wing sitting room and folded her hands and said, "I want to be honest with you. I'd appreciate that." I said, "I've treated you as someone less important than you are, less significant than you are to Daniel, and frankly, less impressive than you clearly are." She paused. "I'm aware that this conversation might read as me adjusting my opinion of you because I found out you have money. I want to acknowledge that possibility directly, because I think you'd notice it anyway, and I'd rather say it than pretend it isn't there." This surprised me. I hadn't expected that degree of self-awareness. "The money doesn't change what happened." I said, "No, it doesn't. The fact that you've now recalibrated my value based on what I own is itself the problem. Brooke, I wasn't less worthy of consideration before you knew about this. I know that." "Do you?" She was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something honest. "I grew up in a world where people's resources were a signal of their character," she said. "I know intellectually that's wrong. I don't think I ever examined whether I actually believed it. And now I'm sitting in a 16th century farmhouse that belongs to a man I've been treating as a convenient inconvenience for 6 years." She said, "So I'm examining it." I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was 36 years old and intelligent, and had been shaped by her upbringing into someone who mistook categories for people. She was also, I thought, sitting in front of me with more honesty than I'd expected from her, which was either growth or strategy, and I wasn't sure yet which. "I'm not going to tell you whether I accept your apology," I said. "That's not a decision you make in a single conversation. You'll know whether I accept it by how things change." "That's fair. I'd like you to call me Dad." Something shifted in her face. "Small, but real. I can do that," she said. "Dad." It was awkward. It was the right kind of awkward, the kind that comes from doing something true rather than something easy. The last 3 days of the trip changed in texture. The way weather changes, not dramatically, but pervasively. Meals grew longer and less careful. Gerald told a story about a property deal in 1994 that had gone spectacularly wrong. And I told a story about the time I'd rewired an industrial furnace in a snowstorm at 2 in the morning. And the conversation moved the way conversations should, without a controller. Brooke asked Marco about the vineyard and listened to the whole answer. She asked Elena about the honey. And when Elena disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a jar of the estate variety to take home, Brooke looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, gratitude that wasn't transactional. Daniel and I walked the vineyard on the second-to-last morning, down the long rows in the early heat, talking about nothing important: the soil, the vines, whether Brunello was better than Barolo, a question Marco had opinions about, and then talking about something important, which was Carol, and what she would have thought of the hills, the light, the ancient stone, the fact that her husband owned all of it. She would have cried. Daniel said, "Happy crying. The kind she did when she was proud." She would have cried, and then told me not to be smug about it. I said. Daniel laughed, fully and without self-consciousness. And for a moment he was 22 years old again, and his mother was still alive, and I was just his father, which is all I'd ever really wanted to be. The family left on a Tuesday. Luggage, loaded into 2 cars, Marco had arranged. The goodbyes were different from the arrivals, longer, less managed, less performed. Gerald shook my hand and held it a beat, longer than formal. Patrice kissed my cheek and said in a low voice, "Don't wait another 6 years." Scott and Megan waved from the car with the ease of people who had decided I was now simply part of the picture. Brooke hugged me, briefly, but fully. No performance in it. Daniel held on for a moment at the gate. neither of us speaking. And then he got in the car, and they drove down the hill, and I watched the dust settle on the cypress-lined road. I stayed 3 more days. I sat on the terrace with estate wine, and worked through operational details with Marco, and called Pat about the fall rental schedule. I walked the vineyard every morning at 6, and stood in the wine cellar in the afternoon. In the cool, underground dark, among the bottles that held the specific patience of something made well and left to become the last night, I called Daniel. How's the travel? Good. Long. Dad, I know. I need to say it anyway. What you did, not just the property, but the conversation, the ledger, saying it plainly instead of just disappearing into it. That mattered. It mattered to me too. I said, things are going to change. They already have. I love you. I love you too. Drive safe from the airport. I hung up and sat on the terrace in the dark and poured the last glass from the bottle and looked at the valley. The scattered lights. The ancient hills. The dark cypresses against the stars. Carol's voice, quiet as always. The way it sounds now when I hear it interior. Without direction. Everywhere. Let it teach you. It was still teaching me. The way the important things do slowly. Continuously. As long as you're willing to keep attending to them. I lifted my glass toward the valley. Toward Montalcino. Toward the dark vineyard below the house. Toward nothing and everything. Then I finished the wine and went inside. Before you leave, if this story stayed with you, please hit that like button and subscribe, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments. And when you're ready for the next one, it's right there on your screen.